Final Fantasy X is known for its hero's common refrain of "This is my story," a motif that Tidus recalls both in his narration and in-game dialogues. Yet popular discourse on Final Fantasy X has long since reconsidered his role in the overall story, as opposed to that of Lady Yuna, upon whose pilgrimage we embark, whose aeons we acquire, and whose journey to defeat sin we witness. So a reasonable argument exists that it might in fact be Yuna's story, within which Tidus is the eyes and ears of the player, the window into and narrator of events, much like a Plato to Socrates, rather than the main man himself. It's always been an interesting discussion point, and owes largely to the depth and richness of Final Fantasy X's writing, I think. And yet, a later, perhaps more intriguing take on the game also exists, which I've touched on in the past, which is the suggestion that Final Fantasy X could be viewed as Auron's story, as much, if not more so, than both Tidus and Yuna. And I love this idea because not only does it elevate an otherwise archetypal, secondary mentor character to the centre stage, but if we account for Auron's particular arc, what his intentions indeed might be, it completely changes our perspective on the story and the journey of Final Fantasy X. So, what's the case for Auron being the central character? How much stock should we put in this? And how does it alter the intentions, outcomes, and impression of the events and overall story of Final Fantasy X when looked at from Auron's perspective? Kicking off, what's most clear about Auron's role in the game is how he is the catalyst for Tidus' arrival in Spira and his involvement in Yuna's pilgrimage. The beginning of the game shows his mysterious appearance in Zanarkand, his initially unclear salute to the incoming sin, and his eventual thrusting of Tidus up into the void that transfers him to Spira, remarking as they go that this is your story. As mentioned, Auron appears in the role of the elder guide here, handing Tidus his first sword, much like how other mentor archetypes do so, Obi-Wan Kenobi giving Luke Skywalker the lightsaber for example, and he doesn't appear again until later on in the game, becoming Yuna's guardian, and making it seem that for all intents and purposes, Tidus is our hero, and Auron is this secondary figure who helps guide Tidus and Yuna along. However, another, and perhaps most important, aspect of Auron's involvement in the story is him being this link between past and present, between parent and child, with Braska and Yuna on the one hand, and Jecht and Tidus on the other, this multi-generational sort of relationship that Auron oversees and spans. And a conventional reading of the game might view this as fated or serendipitous. Some might view it as Auron states in the game, fulfilling a promise to his friends to look after their children. But what it also does, particularly looking at the game from an Auron perspective, is perhaps provide motive. It gives reasons for Auron's actions and appearances, and it makes him, in many respects, the centre point of the story, who brings these key characters from past and present together, and indeed prompts the significant events to pass once Tidus comes into contact with Yuna. Indeed, taking a step back to look at the playable party of Final Fantasy X in general, most of them are present because of Auron, having not only Auron himself in the party of course, but the aforementioned Tidus and Yuna. We have Kamari Ronso, who a dying Auron had sent to look for Yuna and look after her in his stead, while he presumably became unsent and then travelled to Zanarkand to watch over Tidus. And in an inadvertent way, we could also argue that Wakka and Lulu end up involved because Auron asked Kamari to take Yuna to Besaid, which is where she was raised, and of course Wakka and Lulu hail from. So Auron's an incredibly important linchpin to most of the characters that feature in the party and the events that transpire there. And as we play through Final Fantasy X, we learn quite quickly that Auron spares little love for Yevon, which is the governing body of Spira, and this culminates in the successive twists that not only is Yevon a complete hypocrisy, not only do summoners die just to temporarily defeat sin at the end of their journey, but also that Auron himself is an unsent, having been killed by Yunalesca at the end of Braska's journey. So once again, this just builds further motive, looking at things from an Auron perspective as to why he might have come back, why is he bringing these children together and not just allowing himself to be laid to rest. And I think ultimately off the back of this, it leads to a crucial and very interesting question about his ultimate motives, and by extension I think whether or not Auron wants or expects Yuna to complete her pilgrimage at all. And this is where Tidus enters the scene, and from a slightly more cynical, slightly more duplicitous perspective, from Auron's perspective, we could argue that Auron has set in motion these events, telling Tidus that this is his story to galvanise this heroic mindset, bringing these two teenagers together to salvage Yuna from her predestined path, but ultimately as a means to undermine and indeed bring down the governing hand of Yevon, by whom Auron feels betrayed and has set in his sights to destroy. Indeed, the flashback sphere sequences are all the more important when looked at this way, because not only do they offer snapshots of Braska's pilgrimage, Jecht's demeanour and so on, which is what makes them quite interesting and entertaining to see, but also what we see in these flashbacks is Auron's devoutness to Yevon. He in many respects has this whacker sort of mindset about him, which leans into zealotry for Yevon's cause, and he's very much beholden and blinded to it. And it makes Auron's betrayal that much more potent and meaningful, because we see how extensive that betrayal must have been, how far he must have fallen to go from this devoutness to the sort of embittered, quiet older man we meet in the contemporary events of the game. And we see this in the contemporary events when he's in conversation with former friends such as Kinnock, who has worked his way up the ranks of Yevon, between himself and the maesters such as Seymour, and we glimpse this barely disguised resentment that dwells within Auron, and I think propels Auron along this journey, as much, if not more so, than simply fulfilling a promise to his old friends, which actually, if you look at a certain way, seems like a relatively flimsy excuse for the things that Auron does and the catalyst to the events that transpire. So ultimately it's a very important and interesting consideration to look at Final Fantasy X this way, because doing so, it completely changes the sort of genre of the game and the trajectory of the story. It becomes much more of a revenge tragedy rather than necessarily a love story or a liberation story. And I'm not so naive to suggest that the game is entirely about Auron. We needn't see these genres or perspectives as mutually exclusive either. And I do think there's enough evidence in the text to show the revenge tragedy angle holds up quite well and is certainly at work with Auron. And those aware of his demise, such as Kamari, such as Mr. Rin even, who do make, the latter of which does make a guarded comment about it, in some ways it makes them more interesting as well, because it's almost as if they are complicit in their silence, if not their general wariness of what this fabled guardian is up to. So, really interesting topic, a really interesting conversation that, as I say, has been going on almost as long as Final Fantasy X has been around. I think it certainly shifts the dial on what Final Fantasy X is ultimately about, what these character arcs and character motives entail. And while Auron, just at face value, is a very cool, well-written character in this sort of quiet reserve and elder mentor role that he has, I think looking at it from his perspective, what he's bottling up and what he's allowing or indeed encouraging to pass in terms of breaking away from Yevon, I think it just adds another layer to him and is just further testament to what a brilliantly written character he is in an already excellent story. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon. Alternatively, if you feel like donating me a coffee, you can do so. The links are available below.